So a bunch of new previews and hands-on impressions for Onimusha Way of the Sword and Resident Evil 9 Requiem have officially hit after Summer Game Fest, and it sounds like there's a lot of really cool, interesting stuff happening with both of these Capcom games, so we're going to take a look at those in today's video. If any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button. It really does support the channel a ton, and if you're new here and you like what you hear, you can subscribe and let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. So we'll be starting off first with Onimusha Way of the Sword, and we'll be pulling impressions from Noisy Pixel as well as Michael Huber of the Easy Allies. Also, massive shout out to Huber. He got to speak with the devs and he asked them some really great questions that I haven't seen anyone ask those devs before, so those are going to be some pretty exciting things to go over. But starting off first with combat, and based on everything we're seeing so far, it really feels like they're just taking the combat of the first three Onimushas in particular and really just modernizing them and evolving them for games today. Of course, we have our classic souls that we collect as we fight, so it's really stressing the risk-reward aspect of, do I fight this enemy and then absorb the souls, or do I forego the souls and then block my next attack and focus on that next group of enemies, which is pretty unique to Onimusha. Now, what's interesting is that they still have the blue, yellow, and red soul system, where yellow is for health and red is for experience to upgrade your stuff, but they've repurposed the blue souls. The blue souls used to be for all of your different elemental weapons to allow you to do special magic attacks. Well, in Way of the Sword, the blue souls have now been repurposed as power souls. And this is something that was asked by Huber in his interview, where he said, will we have different weapons to use throughout the game? And the developer said, no, we're actually going to be focusing specifically on Musashi and his sword. But if you collect enough of those blue souls, Musashi can temporarily summon a new weapon to use in combat, which we've seen in previous trailers. There's like the dual lightning daggers, the double mallets, and for a specific period of time, he'll be able to use those weapons in combat, which I quite like. It's a nice change of pace. I've recently gone through Onimusha 1 and 2 remaster, and while I do like having the different weapons because they did have different play styles, I always kind of found myself gravitating to specific weapons over other ones just because I felt like they were superior. So to have a situation where now I'm using those blue souls not just purely for a magic attack, but to summon a specific weapon, and I'm assuming we're going to have a few different choices here, I think is actually really cool. And of course, you get these blue souls by attacking, but they also mention that if Musashi blocks enough, he will also obtain more blue souls, which puts him into that powered up state to summon those weapons. And again, with combat, it's really just going to be an evolved version of what we got in those first three games. We see Musashi do so many cool things in these trailers that's been released. There's moments where he blocks an attack where he just places the sword behind him without even looking. It looks really slick. We've got parries that lead into environmental attacks by throwing a demon into some sort of cloth, which blinds him and causes him to attack his allies. You can push demons into torches, which sets them on fire, which makes them a fire hazard for their allies around them. We've even seen in the most recent trailer where Musashi blocks a projectile attack at the perfect time, sending it back at a group of enemies, taking all of them out. So again, that timing on the parries and the blockings are going to be essential like they were in the original games. Now here's something that's new and super cool, is that enemies, and I'm assuming most enemies, maybe all of them, will have a stagger bar. You can drain that bar from attacking, doing parries, or blockings, and essentially what it does is once that bar is completely drained, you can do what's called an Isen break, where combat freezes and you can pick a different limb on the enemy to strike down. And according to the devs in Huber's interview, different body parts give you different rewards. So some body parts will give you a damage boost to the enemy, some body parts will give you more souls. But what's really cool is that there's no canned animations for this Isen break. Everything is completely unique. And again, I think it's those Isen attacks that really kind of separate Onimusha from, modern day Souls-like games where, yeah, parrying is important in something like a Sekiro, but in Onimusha, it wasn't just parrying. You had that Isen attack, which is a critical attack where if you time your attack just right with the opponents, you will strike them down in one hit. And what's even cooler is if you had a group of enemies and you timed your attack properly, you could take them all out with critical Isen attacks. It's a super cool, flashy ability, which is now being brought back for Way of the Sword. And one of the most fun things about the perfect blocks and the Eason attacks in the original games was trying to find that parry window, finding the right timing, because when you nailed it, it was such a satisfying feeling of, wow, I just had this really fast attack, this big flash of animation, and now the enemy is just lying there on the ground dead. And again, it's that risk-reward gameplay that I think really is going to set Onimusha apart from a lot of these other games and create really interesting scenarios where maybe you are doing a block or a perfect parry in those Eason attacks. But what if you're surrounded? Do you forego absorbing those souls, or do you continue to attack enemies? So it really does create some interesting situations where you're like, dang, I just got a bunch of souls, but I am surrounded. I can't risk absorbing them right now. Now, one thing we pointed out in the previous trailer was that it looked like the gauntlet was going to help you with environmental stuff like puzzles. And by using the gauntlet, you can reveal different choke points that are being blocked by Genma. If you can take them out, then you might get a secret path which might have a cool reward. But in some areas, you can actually absorb what souls are there, and it gives you an image of the last moments of the people that were there. So if there was a warrior fighting and they were cut down, you get to relive that moment. So it's a really cool aspect to world building. It gives you an idea of what they're doing with the story and with the environments, which I genuinely do appreciate. And I think a lot of other Onimusha fans appreciate that as well. And it's also a really cool way to implement more puzzle stuff. So I don't know if there's gonna, be like puzzle boxes like they had in the original games. I kind of hope they do. Those were really satisfying little brain teasers, but I think for the most part it seems like it's gonna be more of an environmental thing this time around. So moving away from gameplay, there was some more story stuff that Huber was able to get out of the devs that I thought was super interesting. So when it comes to Musashi and his gauntlet, he's actively trying to get rid of this thing. He's a true swordsman, he believes in his skills, and he doesn't want to rely on that to get by. However, Kojiro, who is going to be like our pursuer enemy of the game, who also has a gauntlet, he's straight up utilizing that thing to its fullest to slaughter anyone that gets in his way. So it's a really cool contrast between our hero and potential villain of one relying too much on the power and maybe one not utilizing it enough because of pride or, just their own skill. Which I think could lead to a really cool story moment where Musashi just fully embraces that gauntlet and the power that comes with it, and he can become a true Onimusha. It'd be a really awesome character moment for someone like Musashi Miyamoto. The woman that we saw at the end of the previous trailer is in fact the physical embodiment of the gauntlet, and she's going to be able to communicate with us throughout the game. So she's going to be a guide, and I think the relationship between them could be pretty interesting, especially since Musashi seems to be a little bit of a silly character at times. Yeah, he's a great swordsman, but he's got some humor moments, and I'm kind of curious to see how that relationship plays out. Musashi will have allies in the game, but unfortunately, we won't be able to play as any of them or gift them things like we could in Onimusha 2. Now here's a big thing. Musashi does come from the Netflix Onimusha series, but the devs say that this game is not connected to that anime at all. In fact, this game is a completely new standalone title that doesn't fall anywhere within the timeline of the original Onimusha games, which is kind of cool. It makes it its own thing, but I was kind of secretly hoping in the back of my mind that maybe Samanosuke or Jubei would show up at certain points to maybe do something cool or become like unlockable characters, or maybe have their outfits or some mention of them, because I really loved how Capcom handled those characters. And finally, Huber did ask them, we had 7 years between the first and second Onimusha remasters, will we have to wait for a third one? And they didn't divulge too much information, but it sounds like they do plan to remaster Onimusha 3, which I cannot wait. I know, is it Jean Reno, who was in that game? He's apparently already given his okay for Capcom to use his likeness again, so that shouldn't be standing in the way of doing an Onimusha 3 remaster, which I cannot wait. That's the one I played the least, but I'd be really excited to go back and visit that. So all in all, Onimusha Way of the Sword, it doesn't have a firm release date just yet. I assume it'll probably come out after Resident Evil 9 next year, but I cannot wait. It really seems like they're bringing all of the great aspects of the original Onimusha games back, really modernizing them, and they're clearly passionate. They said in Huber's interview that they've actually been wanting to bring Onimusha back for quite some time, but it wasn't until 2020 when they felt like they finally had the right people in place to do so. And that's one thing, again, that I appreciate about Capcom is modern Capcom isn't going to just rush something out if it's not ready and if they don't have the proper people in place. They really want to make sure that everything is lined up properly to make sure that a game comes out the best it can possibly be, which I really love. And that's one of the reasons why they're so successful these days and are entering like a new cap god tier of their company. And they're just celebrating over 40 years in the gaming industry, which is pretty big. So I think around the time of Gamescom, we'll get more information, possibly a new trailer, and maybe, you know, sometime in the future, they'll be able to put out a demo that we can all try, because I can't wait to get my hands on this game. And having revisited Onimusha 1 and 2 again very recently, it just makes me super hyped to see what they do. And also, again, big shout out to Michael Huber for doing such an incredible interview. I'll leave a link in the description so you guys can check that out. He asked some really great questions, stuff that only a fan would ask, and he got some really cool responses. So up next, we are moving over to Resident Evil 9, and for these previews and impressions, we're going to be pulling from Susie the Sphere Hunter, who is phenomenal. She makes like some of the best Resident Evil retrospective videos on the internet. Her content in general is just fantastic. And we're also going to be pulling from Maximilian Dude, who got a chance to actually not just watch the gameplay demo, but play it a few times. So with the demo, it opens up with Grace being tied down in a very spooky hospital environment, and she's having her blood drained. A little bit more on that later. The whole gist of the demo is essentially sneaking your way through this hospital and trying to find a way out. So you do come across some tools, screwdrivers, also some throwable items like bottles, but eventually Grace comes across a zombie, which isn't your enemy. Funny enough, that bigger creature that we see in the trailer shows up, eats the zombie, and that monster then becomes basically like a pursuer type enemy that blocks our path and stops us from progressing through that stage. And again, this enemy is basically acting as the pursuer of this section of the game, using vents and walls to crawl around and surprise the player when they least expect it, even busting through some of those walls, which creates new paths for you to actually get through. So you actually do have to explore this area, try to distract this monster so it can create paths for you to use to escape. It's super cool, and based on the way Max and Susie described it, it is super dynamic. Max talked about finding the enemy, running back to a safe room for the second time, and as he's in that room, the lights just explode due to a big clap of thunder and a flash of lightning, and it scared the crap out of him. And based on what they've been saying and based on other previews, it doesn't seem like the entire game is going to be like this. You'll just have sections with Grace where it is very classic RE7, RE8 first-person perspective, where it's less about fighting and more about surviving and hiding, distracting the enemy to eventually escape before you get murked. Now, one thing everyone is pointing out, and this is pretty big, is at the end of that gameplay demo, they go into the settings menu and they show that you can actually change the perspective from first person to third person, which I think is nice. I know there's a lot of people who they enjoy modern Resident Evil, but they're not a big fan of the first person perspective. I don't really mind it. I personally tend to prefer third person for my Resident Evil games, but to give people an actual choice between the two and make that third person mode a proper third person perspective is great. Because when Resident Evil Village released, I believe it was post-launch, they added a third-person perspective, but it wasn't like a true, proper third-person perspective. It felt kind of weird, it looked kind of weird. You could tell that they essentially had the gameplay mechanics from first-person try to transfer over to third-person, and it just didn't really feel good. But this is going to be a true separate first and third-person experience, which I think is great. Now, as Max was playing, he noticed that when he went to change the perspective, for that specific section of the game, it said that first person was recommended, which led him to believe that there would probably be sections where third person would be recommended, which kind of leads into the rumors of will Leon or some classic character come back, and we'll mostly use them in the third person perspective like we had in RE2 Remake, RE3, and RE4 Remake, which should be more action oriented, I would assume, you know, if they're bringing someone back like Leon or Jill. But either way, the way that Susie and Max described this session, Max in particular said it reminded him so much of Alien Isolation. And if you have not played that game, that is legitimately one of the scariest games I think I've ever played or seen someone play. And if you don't know what it is, essentially you're in first person perspective in that game on a ship trying to escape while being hunted down by a xenomorph who is using vents. in different rooms to track you, and this sucker will literally show up at the worst moments possible. You're at a door frantically trying to put in a passcode, and you can hear that xenomorph land and make a beeline towards you. It is frightening. So for him to get those vibes with this section of the game, I think is great, and I think that means it's going to be really truly scary and really just kind of like blow people away who haven't experienced that type of pursuer enemy before. But what's cool is that Max said that because the enemy was so dynamic and it was pursuer-like, it really forced him to use his environment to try and figure out some sort of strategy to progress through and create and open up those new paths. So it sounds like it's going to be really fun and dynamic, and I cannot wait to check it out myself. And I think this is going to be indicative of what Grace's sections will be. If there are multiple characters, if we're just going off of, like, let's say there's a Grace and let's say there's a Leon, I think Grace's sections will be recommended first person perspective. Super scary, frightening, intense. You're not going to be focused on fighting back. You're going to be focused on defense, hiding, distracting the enemy, and trying to find your path out of there, which fits with the character of Grace. Based on what we've seen of her so far, she's easily startled. She's not the most coordinated, and I don't expect her to just pull out a gun and start fighting enemies. But to Susie's credit, she does say that based on what she saw in that demo, while Grace isn't the most coordinated character, she does have a lot of fight in her, which makes sense. Her mom is Alyssa, after all, so she's got something passed down. And it just kind of makes me wonder about the story. If Leon does come back, which I hope he does, returning to Raccoon City, you know, you got to have a classic character come back. On the flip side of Grace, I would assume that would mean that Leon would be our action guy, because they do say there will be those action set pieces in this game. So I think his gameplay will be like what we've come to know from RE4 Remake in particular. So the dodging, the parries, all the cool contextual melee stuff, I assume will be Leon stuff. But based on some of the rumors I've heard, apparently Leon is not in Raccoon City. So my headcanon is maybe he's somewhere off in the country or another part of the world on a mission, and maybe that mission is what brings him back to Raccoon City, or he's contacted by the FBI to find and rescue Grace because she's been captured and maybe they haven't heard from her. So Leon's going to have to rescue another Grace, and they're going to have to work together to figure out what the heck is going on. Max also had this really cool big-brained theory of what if you incorporate Jill, and Grace would be the first person perspective, Leon would be third person over the shoulder, and Jill would be static camera. That would be sick. I hope Jill comes back. Look, I love Leon. He's always represented in these games, but I just really truly love Jill. I feel like she's underutilized, and the last time they focused on Jill, other than RE3 Remake, was the Resident Evil animated movie Death Island, which was 100% Jill focused. So I'm hoping they bring Jill back and really expand upon her and let us use her again, especially if this is, you know, a story that's going to potentially cap off a 30-year story arc that started with the original Resident Evil. I think you got to bring some classic characters back. Now, in regards to the characters and what we're seeing in those monsters, Susie has an incredible breakdown of what's going on, and I'll leave a link in the description, but chances are if you're watching this video, you probably already watched Susie's video. Again, her stuff is incredible. But she mentions that perhaps that hooded man we've been seeing throughout the trailers is after Grace because of her blood, with her mom Alyssa Ashcroft being the canon survivor of Resident Evil Outbreak. She also created the Daylight vaccine, which cured her of the T-virus, which means that Grace probably has some sort of immunity to that virus, and maybe that's why that guy wants her. Because the few shots of that dude we've seen, he looks sickly. He looks like he's mutated or mutating, but he's still very conscious and doing human things. So maybe he's looking for a cure. The other speculation, and I think this is 100% going to happen, Max and Susie, and now me, both believe that that big creature that we see in the trailers and that they fought against in the gameplay demo is none other than Lisa Trevor from Resident Evil Remake. And Susie even points out that in the trailer that we've seen on Capcom of a lot of the content creators' reactions to that gameplay demo, you straight up hear the same Lisa Trevor sound effect from RE1 Remake where she screams and lunges at you.
Even hear this RE9 monster in the SGF reaction room that I was in. Take a listen for yourself.
And it's not just that, it's the sound of her chains that you hear in the trailer as well. And in the OG RE1 remake, whenever Lisa was around, those were the two things you heard, was her moaning and the chains. And we never see her die in RE1 remake. We just see her jump into a pit, presumably to her death. But Lisa was essentially this monster that was experimented on, this innocent girl who just, her story is super tragic and depressing, but she was basically unkillable in that game. So again, we don't see a body, we don't see her die. And if she's as strong and powerful as we think she is, she could have very well survived that nuke that hit Raccoon City, because the whole city, while it's, pretty dilapidated, still has stuff standing. Structures are still there. Monsters and zombies are clearly still there. So it stands to reason that Lisa, being on the outskirts of, Raccoon City at the mansion, would have survived that nuke and perhaps evolved into something much scarier and more vicious, which would be a super cool callback to RE1 in the beginning of that story to bring back a Lisa Trevor, but she's now much more mutated and unhinged. But again, at Gamescom, there will be more information on RE9. Hopefully by then we'll get a new trailer for that and Onimusha, but those are the previews for these two games. Again, I'll leave links in the description down below to Max's video, Susie's video, Huber's video with the allies in the Noisy Pixel article if you guys would like to dive in a little bit more. But with that being said, that's the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think so far of Onimusha Way of the Sword in terms of its gameplay mechanics, some of the changes they're making, but also Resident Evil 9 Requiem. What are your thoughts on the two perspective modes, and do you think that big monster is in fact Lisa Trevor, and do you think Leon is gonna come back? Maybe Jill. I'm crossing my fingers we get to see Jill again. I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.